I go with you. So I won't be afraid. This my hope, come what may. Where I go with you. Where I go with you. Yeah.
Well, it's good to see you this morning, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to move us into a new series that we're going to start today. Over the next few weeks, we want to be talking about the idea of intersect. And in doing that, we want to think about different ways that our life intersects with what God is doing in the world. And we know that this time of year, as we start a school year and start a new semester, that there are students who are getting acquainted with new classes. There are teachers who are getting acquainted with new students. Maybe in your work, there's a rhythm that has shifted and you're getting acquainted with something new. And that's because at this time of year, we have these intersects that are a part of our life that we don't want to ignore, but we want to acknowledge. But in that acknowledgement, what we really want to do is to focus on what God is teaching us, where God is leading us, through these different kinds of intersects. In my life, I want you to know that I am most often the driver for my family. I started to say I was the designated driver, but you start thinking about something else, and I didn't want to really distract you there. I am, but I do the driving. My son, he doesn't like to drive that much. I do most of the driving, and he does the navigating when we go on trips. Occasionally, Sharon will drive. Back in the early days, she would drive just a little bit. But the older I've gotten, the more it's become. I am the one who's doing the driving in our family. So when I get in a car, here's one of the things about the way that I drive. I am not haphazard. I do not speed anymore. Yeah, eventually you'll get to that place where you just kind of slow down. But I do get anxious when I drive, and I'm not anxious about traffic. I'm not anxious about directions. I'm really, to be quite honest, I'm just anxious about getting to where I need to go. Well, let me be honest with you this morning. I'm that way in life as well. I think from the time that I became an adult and got a job and developed a career, I've been quite anxious to get to this place where I am right now in life. There's an anxiousness that I have, and so here's what I've noticed. That a lot of times in my life, that anxiousness creates something that causes me to miss the significance of the intersects in my life. The first thing that I have in our notes this morning is that we have intersections for a reason. If nothing else but to slow us down or to slow others down. We have these intersections in our life for a reason. Spiritually speaking, those intersections are in our life for a reason as well also. And we want to pay attention to them. We want to pay attention to what God is doing in us, what God is doing in others, what God is doing in the world, so that in being more attentive to what all is around us, we take seriously these intersects in our life, and we're not just focused on moving to the next thing in our life, the next place. We can become less anxious about those places, those intersects that we might encounter. The other thing about intersections is this, that there's a pattern to intersections. When Sharon and I first moved to Houston, this was some time ago, this is before we had children, and all of our life really had been living in small towns, except for Abilene, if you want to consider Abilene a large town. Some do, some don't. Depends on where you're from. Abilene was about as big as we had ever lived in, but we moved from Albany, Texas to Houston, Texas. And when we moved to Houston, Texas, we moved into the area of Houston that was growing the fastest. It was some of the fastest growing counties in the nation. We moved on to the very edge of Fort Bend County, which is west of Highway 6, if you're familiar with Houston and sort of the dynamics of that, and it was south of I-10. And because those areas were developing quickly, they would build schools in neighborhoods. These neighborhoods would emerge, they would build schools, and so the traffic patterns developed the slowest. So really, for the first time in my life, I had to deal with four-way stops. Now, we've got one right up the street here. And I want you to know that if I pull up to that four-way stop, I know the rules. I mean, I hope you knew that there's rules to that. It's more than just first one there gets to go next. In fact, I was so nervous about it, there were 3 four-way stops before we got out of our neighborhood when we lived in Houston. And so at that time, I still had my old, and it was old, my driver's ed booklet. And so I looked it up. What are the rules? So what happens if you get to a four-way stop simultaneously with someone else? Do you know the rules? The person on the right gets to go first. All right? So I'm watching for you. Right up here on 12th and Elm. Did I get that right? All right, I'm a homer now. I've been here long enough. I know the streets. There are patterns, and those patterns are there for a reason. When you show up to a stoplight, you have 3 choices. There's 3 signals. And if you're going to pay attention to those signals, it's red, you stop. If it's yellow, you don't hurry up. That's to say, slow down. Slow down. That's a good one for us in the church, in faith. Or green, let's go. In that, spiritually speaking, we ought to pay attention to the patterns and what they mean for us spiritually. Because there's nothing more disturbing for a person of faith to have the green light, but all they see is red. It can be just as frustrating for a person whom God has shown a green light, but you're just still being cautious. Or how about that person who just never stops? And God's saying to you, let's do more than just pump the brakes here. Let's come to a complete stop. These patterns exist for a reason, and we want to pay attention to them because I believe that in our life, spiritually speaking, it's at these intersects where we have the opportunity to encounter God. Now, if you're only in a hurry and that's your only mode of operation, then you're going to miss that. Let me just ask you this. Can you think of one new person that you've encountered this last week in your life? Because I'm going to venture a guess here. That God has introduced you this last week to someone new, but if you weren't paying attention to the intersect, you missed it. Let me give you another one. Have you become aware in your life this last week of a spiritual need that someone else has? Because I'm going to tell you that you probably have. But unless you are paying attention to the intersect of God in your life, you might have missed their declaration of what that spiritual need was, what that spiritual need is. Let me ask you one more. Have you discovered something this last week in your own life that's a spiritual need that you've not yet expressed to God? My hunch this morning is that there's been something in your life. But if we haven't been paying attention to the intersect of God in our life, we might not have realized that we might ought to make that a matter of prayer in our life, or a matter of action in our life, or a matter of confession in our life. What I've discovered since working on this series is that the Bible is full of illustrations of what Intersect looks like for us. In the same way that our life, your life, is full of these same kinds of Intersect. This morning, I want to point our attention towards a passage of Scripture. And before we get there, I want to tell you something about that passage. If you've not already opened your text or opened your device to look at that Scripture, here's what you're going to find. There's going to be a heading there that suggests, that says that some manuscripts do not include this story. And let me just tell you this morning, that's a story in and of itself. In all of the Bible that we have this one notice that says what you're about to read, this story that you're about to read, has not been included in all the manuscripts that we've ever had that we use for the Bible. Now, there's a lot of speculation on why this occurs, why that's what we read in this text before we read the actual story. Part of that is in the earliest time when we received these, when we were doing these manuscripts, they were written by hand. And when you go back to the earliest manuscripts, what you found in Christian history was that this story was omitted in most of those manuscripts. Then as we developed these other translations, people would go through these multitude of manuscripts, and it would be absent in most, but present in one. And so they had to make a judgment on whether or not that was going to be included in these translations. Now, what we know about this story is this. We believe it to be true, because we have historical evidence that people referred to it over and over again in their experience. There are references to this story as if it actually happened, and so we assume that it actually happened. So when we read this story in just a moment, I don't want you to be thrown off by that little note there, that special note, because you're not going to see that anywhere else in Scripture. If you have a text this morning and want to look at this, it's in John chapter 8. It really ends with John 7:53, where it just says that the people began to disperse. They began to go to their homes. But it says in John 8, starting here, it says, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. And at dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him. He sat down to teach them. And then the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. And they made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus, for whatever reason, he bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, in other words, they didn't let up. They didn't just let this go, his reaction. They responded to his reaction by continuing to question him. And finally, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And then again, he stooped down and he wrote on the ground. At this saying, those who had heard began to go away one at a time. The older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. At that point, Jesus straightened up and he asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." One of the suggestions about why there's this thought about this being eliminated from some of the manuscripts is the sort of the end conclusion to how this story ended. There were those that felt that possibly the early writers and translators felt like Jesus treated adultery too lightly. And so when you read the text, you can kind of see why you might this morning be led to that conclusion. But it's still an experience where we want this morning to open our eyes to this intersect of this woman with Jesus. This woman had a condition, a human condition. That human condition was sin, specifically adultery, and the Pharisees caught her, they say, the Scripture says, in the very act of adultery. So if you're the kind of person this morning who's really good at playing scenes that you read out in your mind as if they were a movie, then you have to be careful, because this quickly becomes an R-rated, R-17 and above movie. The Scripture says that she was caught in the very act of adultery. Now, this would be embarrassing for us if we were to experience this at some time in our life, and it was probably should have been embarrassing to those who were there. But it says that the Pharisees, they had an objective, and their objective was not really geared towards this woman. This woman was merely a means to their end, and their end was this: to trip Jesus up, to trap him in his beliefs, then to share those beliefs and let it go viral among their friends, and then they could eliminate Jesus in some fashion. Probably too early to declare how that was going to be now, but they were going to eliminate him so that he could no longer be teaching, so they could cast a shadow on his teaching and his authority. So they bring this woman before Jesus, caught in the very act of adultery. And they make that clear in Scripture, that that's what's happened here. And the Scripture says that rather than responding, Jesus knelt and he began to draw in the sand. I don't know why, but when I've pictured the time when I was a kid and I would take a stick and I would create art. I told you last week I wasn't an artist, but I would create art by drawing with a stick in the sand. That's an interesting response on Jesus' part, don't you think? Maybe it was because he acknowledged in his mannerism, in his response to that, the awkwardness of this situation, this mostly naked woman, I'm assuming, standing in front of them, being accused by people who did not care for her. They didn't care about her in any fashion. They really didn't care about themselves. They were really just trying to get at getting Jesus to say something wrong so that they might condemn him. And so we have this intersect of life where a person is caught in that human condition of sin, but without regarding that specific sin, they're exposed by others who are sinful as well. Those who are full of judgment, those who are full of condemnation. And then they're brought before Jesus, this one who had came upon the scene and began to teach with authority, and people began to recognize him as being different than any other teacher that they had known. And in this experience, what we discover is that the woman that they brought is very aware of her human condition. She was probably well aware of her condition long before she had been exposed. In the same way that in our life, we struggle with the sin that we hold and we keep in our life. We know that our sin does not have to be exposed by others who want to judge us. We know that it's there. We are aware that it's in our life, and we so desperately want to rid ourselves of that. We desperately want to hear the words of Jesus. I do not condemn you. Go and don't live in this sin anymore. Her human condition was desperate, and she found herself in this awkward situation, but because she did, she had the opportunity for her life to intersect with God. Isn't that reassuring? That even in the very worst that we can present to the world about ourselves, that we can find ourselves standing in the presence of God, standing in the presence of one who says to us, I love you. I love you. In fact, we know that he doesn't condemn us because he's going to let his life be a sacrifice for that very sin. In this experience, we're confronted with our human condition, but we're also confronted with the compassion of God. You see, we serve, we love, we develop a relationship with the God that looks past all of this other stuff that might go on in our life sometimes. You see, while she was aware of her condition, she didn't need others to judge her to know where she stood. But you see, when we live a life of the others, then what happens is that we're not able sometimes to see the sin in our own life because we're only seeing the sin of others. You see, Jesus called that out as well. He said that we have a problem with that we kind of struggle in our nature of not noticing the things that are wrong in us, but we notice something wrong in someone else. And so in this experience, we're confronted with God's compassion, and we know that when we come to those intersects in life, that there's times when we're desperately oppressed by what it is that's going on in our life that's keeping us from experiencing the fullness of God's compassion. We don't need anyone else to call it out. We don't need anyone else to point a finger. In our spirits, we're well aware that we've missed the mark, that we're falling short, and that we cannot bring correction to our own life in this situation. The only way that we can bring correction is through the confession of our sin. And then here's what happens. We're confronted really with God's ultimate challenge to us. And that ultimate challenge is this. Go. But as you go, don't sin anymore. As you're going, don't live a life of sin. Let's acknowledge in this experience that what others have done to you is wrong. And what you've experienced and what you've done with your own life is wrong. But I want to set that straight by saying to you, I love you. And because I love you, you have the ability in your life to move forward without sin. The intersect for us this morning is this. Our own human condition, God's compassion for us, and the opportunity to live without sin anymore. This morning, I want you to think about those intersections. And the beauty of starting a new series is that we're going to have the opportunity to look at other intersections throughout Scripture. We're going to be doing this on Sunday mornings and on Wednesday night. I'd encourage you to not miss what God's saying to your life through these intersects. Let me lead us in prayer.
Thank you for joining us at First Baptist Church. We hope you can join us again, online or in person, in Sweetwater, Texas, as we learn to live out God's calling in the world around us.